What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? Dan Heng Lune, aka Super Saiyan Dan, comes out in roughly a week from now, and so I thought it would be good to go over a pre-release build guide for Dan Heng so we can start farming out relics and getting a general idea of how we are going to build our Dan Heng Lune. Now again, be aware this is a pre-release guide, so we're probably going to want to reconvene and reassess the situation with Dan Heng once he releases and we can go over all of his synergies available. But it is good to get a decent idea of how we may want to build our character so we can start theory crafting ahead of time. Alrighty then. Dan Heng in Lune is going to be getting a lot of crit damage buffs based on his skills and abilities. Now, your crit damage doesn't really matter if you're not getting your crits. So you're going to want to build a lot of crit rate on your Dan Heng in Lune in order to maximize his damage. So we're going to talk about Dan Heng in Lune's possible light cones. I'll be talking about his signature light cone first. It is pre-release information, we're not going to go too deep into it, okay? But I will tell you how valuable that light cone is, because his signature light cone does give him a massive, massive buff, okay? Similar to how Jing Yuan got a massive buff from his signature light cone. However, Dan Heng will still work well without the light cone. It's just a crazy buff that he's going to get. So let's talk about the signature cone really quickly. Dan Heng's signature light cone will be increasing his crit rate. It will also be increasing his attack. It will also be increasing his regeneration rate. This is value, value, value. Okay, and it works off of his basic attack. So a lot of people probably think, oh, I'm going to pick up this cone for my other characters. Just be aware it works off of his basic attack, so if your main DPS doesn't really use their basic attack much, this actually isn't a good cone for a lot of other characters, just so you guys are aware of that. Now, let's go in-game and talk about the other options we have, especially for the free-to-play players who probably don't want to pull his signature cone. Alright, so here we are on my alt account, so I don't have every cone available here, but thankfully the databank has every single cone available in the game. So let's go ahead and take a look at this cone here, because this is the cone that most of you are going to end up using, because this is available in Herta's shop. And it also works really well on Dan. We'll talk about that in just a moment. First, I wanted to also mention that Under the Blue Sky is also a very, very solid cone, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But I did want to point this out as well, but it has a caveat. This is available through the gacha system, so it is harder to acquire. This cone, On the Fall of an Aeon, is available through Herta's shop. So most people are going to be able to take this to Superimposition 5. So at Superimposition 5, this will be his best cone besides his signature cone for most of you, okay? Some of you are pulling like whales, and Under the Blue Sky might be more valuable to you if you have it at Superimposition 5. But let's go ahead and talk about the cones, okay? So with Superimposition 5 values, whenever the wearer attacks, their attack is increased by 16% in this battle, so it lasts the whole battle. This effect can stack up to 4 times, and when the wearer inflicts weakness break on enemies, the wearer's damage increases by 24% for 2 turns. So that last effect is an overall damage bonus, very powerful, and at all 4 stacks, the attack value goes up to 64%. As you can imagine, that is a wild amount of damage bonus coming from just the attack alone. So I wanted to point that out. This cone's very, very strong, and you're probably going to have all 4 stacks, and you're probably going to be getting this secondary damage value because Dan Heng in Lune deals spread damage to 3 enemies at once most of the time. It is very likely that some of the enemies you are attacking will be weak to imaginary. He only has to weakness break one of those enemies in order to get this damage bonus. It's likely that's going to happen if he's hitting 3 enemies at a time. So this is a very, very strong cone, and a lot of people are probably going to be using this cone, not just because it's available in Herta's shop, but because it also works very well on Dan. Now let's talk about Under the Blue Sky and why I like it a lot. Under the Blue Sky increases the wearer's attack by 16%, and when the wearer defeats an enemy which is going to be often, the wearer's crit rate increases by 12% for 3 turns. This is a 3-turn crit rate improvement, and it is a very solid amount. 12% is nothing to sleep on. So even at Superimposition 1, this is still a very solid cone, because not everybody is going to have their crit rate super duper high, and even if it is, getting that guaranteed crit rate is absolutely insanely strong, okay? He's going to be getting a lot of crit damage bonuses, so as long as he's critting, he's going to be dealing a ton of damage, okay? So don't sleep on this cone. It is a very, very good cone. It's just newer and harder to get because it's only available through the gacha system. Another cone available through the gacha system that's pretty darn good, the moles welcome you. Excuse me. When the wearer uses their basic attack skill or ultimate to attack enemies, the wearer gains 1 stack of Mischievous. Each stack increases the wearer's attack by 12%. So this isn't exactly a bad cone, but the other 2 cones are more valuable in my opinion. Those are probably his top 3 cones that aren't his signature. A secret vow doesn't help him as much as the other cones, in my personal opinion. Don't get me wrong. Increases the damage dealt by the wearer by 20%. This is very, very solid. This is probably a better bonus than the moles welcome you, but don't forget that these stacks are going to, add up pretty quickly versus this static 20%, because this second bonus isn't really going to matter to you too much. Just be aware of that. This isn't a bad cone. This cone's actually a really, really solid cone, but you don't really care about the HP values. This is a better cone to use on your blade if you have a blade on your team. This is also a really solid cone, but this is again something that works better for Clara. So just be aware of that. The 2 cones I personally like the most are On the Fall of the Aeon and Under the Blue Sky for Dan if you aren't using his signature cone. Alright, now let's get into the meat and potatoes here. We're talking about relics, alright? So try to follow me along here because the relics are obviously like a big chunk of the video, okay? Now, first of all, I want to talk about the imaginary set, because oh yeah, the imaginary set for the imaginary character, duh, ding ding ding, triangle hole goes in the triangle hole. Well, sometimes other sets, mixed sets, actually work really well for characters, but in Dan Heng's case, if you can get the full imaginary set on the guy, it has an incredible bonus over a lot of what other characters are going to get. So the 2-piece increases the imaginary damage by 10%. Obviously, that's good on Dan Heng, but the 4-piece is so synergetic with Dan Heng, it's crazy. When attacking debuffed enemies, the wearer's crit rate increases by 10%, and their crit damage increases by 20% against imprisoned enemies. So, what's an imprisoned enemy? Well, when an imaginary enemy does weakness break on an enemy, when an imaginary character does weakness break on the enemy, it gets imprisoned. And that's how you can get the crit damage bonus. Dan Heng does spread damage to 3 enemies at a time, most of the time that he attacks. So because of that, he's going to be damaging a lot of enemies, and he's going to be weakness breaking them as well. He only needs to get 1 weakness break on the enemies to get that bonus. So he's going to probably have that damage buff active pretty often. And the best part about this is that the crit rate is static as long as the enemy has a debuff. So that's really, really solid. The more crit rate on the guy, the better, okay? Now, you're not necessarily going to absolutely 100% need this crit rate stat if you have your crit rate high enough, but just something to think about there. This is a really easy way to get some crit rate on the guy, okay? So a really, really solid set. The 4-piece is very good, but we want to not forget about something here, okay? Dan Heng's ultimate costs a lot of energy, and he needs to keep his ultimate going as much as possible. He needs to hit his ultimate often in order to maintain stacks of his basic attacks so that he can always do optimal damage with the basic attacks. Otherwise, you're going to be burning a lot of SP energy, and you're not necessarily going to be able to build up your ult very often, and that could be a little costly to your overall damage. His basic attacks do deal most of the damage, but you still want to get those stacks when you can. So you're going to probably want to have speed boots on the character as well, rather than attack percent boots, because the speed boots are going to help you get his speed up to 134 speed. If you can get the character's speed up to 134, your character will be able to go 2 turns every rotation, every other cycle. So that's 2 times every rotation, every other cycle. This will allow your character to have more turns, building their ultimate faster, and ulting more often, and in Dan's case, that will allow him to use his enhanced basic attack at the highest level more often, optimizing his overall damage. So in my opinion, I would prioritize speed boots in order to get your speed to 134 speed. Okay, there's a lot of different ways to do that, we'll go over it, but honestly, if you can just get a pair of speed boots on the imaginary set, you might be able to get to that 134 speed threshold with that alone, the speed boots and some substats. So let's talk about substats. Let's look at this hat. This hat has speed, crit rate, and crit damage. This is almost a perfect roll for Dan Heng and Bibitor Lune. You would basically only want attack percent or break effect on the last stat we haven't got here yet because I haven't leveled it. But in my opinion, the most important stats for him are crit rate and speed, and then crit damage, or attack percent, or break effect. These 3 stats right here are the most important stats for Dan Heng. In fact, pretend this crit damage wasn't here. Crit rate and speed are the most important stats on Dan Heng, in my personal opinion. That's the build that we're looking at right now. And if you have to sub out a 2-piece for your imaginary set rather than go for the full amount, like the full 4-piece, of course, the Musketeer set gives a solid bonus, attack percent by 12%. But there's also the Messenger Hollow Visor head. It's the Messenger traversing hackerspace. The 2-piece gives you a speed bonus of 6%. So if you're struggling to hit that speed threshold, don't forget the 2-piece option where you use the 2-piece of the imaginary set and maybe the 2-piece hackerspace right here. So this is a very solid option to use right here. The hackerspace is a great option. The Musketeer set is also a great option as well. And so that's basically what we're looking at with the main relics. So let's talk about the Planar Sphere here. Because like I was saying, for the substats, you want to go for attack percent on the boots if you have enough speed, or speed boots. I would prioritize speed boots. But don't forget that with your body piece, this is important, this is a must. Crit rate is the most important stat on your body piece. This is the only one you really want to go for. Crit rate body piece. Crit rate body piece. Burn that into your skull. Okay, crit rate body piece. Okay, do not forget it. Crit rate body piece. Then you want to go for something like this hat had, where this hat had a bunch of great stats on it. The speed, the crit rate, the crit damage, attack percent, break effect, things like that. That's great stats for Dan. Now the Planar Spheres. This is a great opportunity to use the red, white, and blue set. I can't recommend this piece enough. The Salsado works because it also gives him crit rate. The 2-piece increases the wearer's crit rate by 8%, but the problem is when the wearer's crit rate reaches 50% or higher, which we're going to get, the wearer's ultimate and follow-up attack damage increases by 15%. But the problem is, he doesn't have a follow-up attack, and his ultimate doesn't get used all that often. We do want to use it pretty often on Dan as much as we can, but it doesn't do as much damage as his enhanced basic attack. So this is a backup plan. Salsado is a backup plan for Dan. You want to be getting 70% crit rate on your Dan in order to use this set properly, so that you can enhance his basic attack and his skill damage by 20%. He doesn't deal skill damage, but he does deal basic attack damage, and it's a huge basic attack. He's going to have the highest basic attack damage in the entire game because it's going to be enhanced. It's his highest damage dealing ability that he has. Believe it or not, his enhanced basic attack is his best ability that he has. All the damage is basically coming from that. And it also increases his crit rate by 8%. So just be aware, with your substats and with your relic piece, with your crit rate body, if you can get it to 62% and then slap this on, it'll give you the extra 8% you need. So don't forget that. 70% crit rate. That's how much crit rate this guy needs. It's a ton, okay? So 70% crit rate, and then this Planar Sphere is going to pop the hell off. And for, the main stat on the relic piece, you're going to want to have imaginary damage boost. I know this says fire damage boost. Forgive me, I don't farm this stuff out for the guy. I'm not pulling Dan, unfortunately. But imaginary damage boost is what you're going to want on this particular planar sphere. It's pretty much, that's the one you want. Imaginary damage. If you can't get imaginary damage, then sure, attack percent is another option, but you're going to definitely want the imaginary damage boost. That's the best one that you can possibly put on him. That's best in slot. And same amount, crit rate, speed, attack percent, the stuff like that. Now with the planar sphere for Dan, you're going to want to have energy regeneration rate. Because you're going to want your Dan refilling his energy as fast as possible so that he can ultimate, so that he can get his stats back. So you're going to want, where do I have one here? Yeah, you're going to want something like this. You're going to want an energy regeneration rate right here on your main stat, and you're going to want to have, the normal stuff: crit rate, crit damage, speed, break effect, attack percent. Prioritize crit rate and speed. But those are the relics for Dan Heng. Okay, we're going to go over some team compositions for Dan Heng as well, because there's honestly a lot. So I'm not going to give you like, oh my god, this is the best team comp right now, because it is pre-release, okay? So I'm just going to tell you about the different ideas you can go for with Dan Heng teams. So there's the mono imaginary team for Dan Heng, which includes Silver Wolf, which is a quantum, but she can apply imaginary weakness to the enemies if you have imaginary units on your team. So full squad of imaginary plus her, really, really solid. But she also works without having the mono imaginary team setup. She's arguably the best character in the game because of the versatility she provides to your team. Silver Wolf, of course, very solid unit. Can't go wrong with Silver Wolf on the team. We're going to also include Locha, best healer in the game. He's an imaginary unit. He works with the mono imaginary team comp. He also works without the imaginary team comp. Then Yukong, again, another character, very solid for Dan Heng, increases crit values and and attack values. She also gives you imaginary damage bonus. All the imaginary team members you have on your team will get an imaginary bonus with her on your team. Very, very solid unit, whether you go full mono imaginary or not. And then, of course, Bronya is a very solid character for Dan Heng. She will be able to provide extra turns for Dan Heng so that he can build his ultimate faster, getting stacks for his basic attack quicker. Very, very solid unit as well. But don't feel like you have to have a 5-star unit to build a Dan Heng team. The free-to-play options are very, very solid as well. Ting Yun will always be a valuable buffer in the game because she has such a high amount of damage bonus that she gives to your character. It's incredible how good Ting Yun is. Yukong is also a free character, and everybody should have a Yukong because you can get her for free in an event, which was like less than a month ago, I think. Pela, incredible free-to-play option, and she's going to be available on a banner very, very soon. She's available on patch 1.3 part 2. Very, very solid free-to-play option. You also have Asta, boosting attack and speed. Remember how good speed is? We're going to be able to boost our Dan Heng, giving him more speed, giving him his ultimate faster, building up his stacks quicker. Very, very solid free-to-play options for a Dan Heng team. Natasha is always going to... She has a cleanse, guys. She has a team-wide heal. She has healing effects that last more than one turn. Natasha is a very solid free-to-play healer. We all used her, man. The only reason why people don't want to use her anymore is just because, we got other options coming and we've been using her since day one. So don't feel like you have to have a 5-star unit in order to play Dan Heng. The free-to-play options are incredibly powerful as well. And of course, don't forget about Welt. It's just a lot of people don't have Welt because he's on the standard banner. He's harder to get, so less people have him. But I'm jealous of anybody who's able to go for mono imaginary with their Welt on their team. If you are going for mono imaginary, he's the second most important character on the team because of how solid he is as a sub DPS character for that team. If you found this video helpful in any way, shape, or form, please leave a like and subscribe. It really does help the channel, because if you don't leave a like and subscribe, I am going to retaliate by eating your snacks in the middle of the night, so just keep that in mind, and I'll catch you guys next time. Good luck on your 50/50s, and good luck pulling for your Dan Heng. I hope you get him early. Peace out.